Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a quorum. Tonight's event is going to be moderated by Historic Chevy Chase DC's President, Carl Lankowski. Carl, if you can take it from here.
Well, good evening, everyone. Glad to see all of you that can attend. I'm here at Lafayette Pointer Park for our session this evening, and our topic is racial geography in DC. As we shall see, in many respects, it's a dismal story of white domination and racial segregation, aided and abetted by public policy with nationwide reach and local complicity. Something that Richard Rothstein compellingly demonstrates in his 2017 book, The Color of Law. The baleful effects include inequities of income and especially of wealth that have never been made up. And yet, the picture is not without exceptions. Integrated neighborhoods have also grown up in DC, in which the worst effects of segregation have been avoided. Even as the legality of housing discrimination has ended, though, the inertia of Jim Crow arrangements continues to impact housing patterns. But we can choose otherwise. So this is not about dictating where people live, it's rather about creating the conditions in which people from any income bracket or racial background will feel fully welcome as part of our community. We take up the topic of DC's racial geography in the context of the values we wish to project in planning the future of our neighborhood, a process that, like it or not, Chevy Chase is undertaking currently. We find ourselves in the midst of a small area plan related to the grander comprehensive plan for DC. And Chevy Chase is also now benefiting from the Main Street program, which focuses on revitalizing our commercial zone along Connecticut Avenue from Chevy Chase Circle down to Livingston Street. There is talk about designating this space as a DC gateway, giving it broader symbolic significance, as we would then presumably be called upon to project city values in this small corner of our polis. Okay, so inclusivity as a value we wish to project begins with open participation in the planning process. And this includes a survey now and visioning workshops in June. You, all of you, are invited to take the survey. Erkin Osberg from the DC Office of Planning is just dropping the link to that into the chat box, if he hasn't already done so. Thanks, Erkin, for doing that. And we hope you'll take advantage of that opportunity. So we're here this evening to discuss the spatial manifestations of America's original sin, looking outward from our neighborhood in Chevy Chase and asking, what is the racial mosaic in which we find ourselves and how did it come to be? We want to start by taking stock of the evolution of settlement patterns by race in DC. Then we want to address the issue of whether the patterns we see could have been otherwise. Another concern is how we engage with the rest of the city to learn from our more distant neighbors what their desires are. And we also want to then address the steps we can take together to project an attitude about the tangled issues of racial equity. Our interlocutor this evening is Neil Flanagan. Neil has earned a reputation of being among the most astute observers of the built environment in DC. He grew up in Ward 3, returning to DC after getting a degree from Yale in architecture. He has produced dozens of perceptive analyses of buildings, neighborhoods, and memorials appearing in local and national publications. To research his topics, he's done painstaking work in the often obscure archives, often not yet even digitized, where illumination is hard won. With his tenacious regard for documentation and empirical detail, Flanagan has recently shed light on transformative moments in the late Reno and the attempt of Black investors to develop land developed from the Chevy Chase Land Company, the Belmont subdivision. which he did with Kimberly Bender of the Hoyerick House Museum. Much of the work already accomplished will enliven the larger manuscript of the transformation of Washington, D.C. during the 1920s, on which Neil now labors. So I guess I've made it pretty clear that we're delighted to have Neil Flanagan with us tonight to address some of these issues involved in the refashioning of the Chevy Chase neighborhood. Welcome, Neil, and thank you for joining us at this key moment of planning in our future.
Carl, can I
Yes.
interrupt for a moment and before Neil starts and ask people, if you have questions during Neil's talk, please enter them in the chat box so that we can accumulate them. And then once he finishes, we'll have time for a more open discussion. So you can all see the chat box where Erkin put the link to the survey, but just type in your questions there and we'll try to address them all during the short time we'll have at the end. But with that interruption, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, well,
No problem. Great.
okay, Neil, thanks. Perhaps the best place to start is with your sense of what is at stake in our community planning process. Your
Sure.
sense of the opportunities and challenges. I was taken by your comment in the chat box during the first public meeting of the Citizens Advisory Committee of the Small Area Plan some weeks ago. Responding to a question about how to make Chevy Chase better, you wrote, and I quote, "The issue is, how can Chevy Chase change to make the district better as a whole?" Now, this is more than a nice turn of phrase. Can you please tell us what you have in mind with this framing?
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you for that very, very generous introduction, and to me, and a very good introduction to the topic at hand. That was a great prologue. Yes. So the question, the reason I asked that question was maybe sort of a subtle point that if you've read the oath that an advisory neighborhood commissioner takes, it's either how they are supposed to interact with the zoning code or their oath that specifically says that they are supposed to consider the interests of the district as a whole, not just their constituents. When they make a great weight comment to various situations. That's not to say that they shouldn't consider local issues, but that has to be at some point at the center, because I think for too long, the District of Columbia is very segregated as it is, and it's possible for people to not think about the consequences of their decisions in designing a neighborhood. That's in many ways. We've had the allocation of certain uses to certain neighborhoods, like where are all the trash transfer plants, where are the industrial zones, and if you study the history, you can see how that becomes an inequitable distribution, particularly in terms of race. And so having that mission of taking the holistic look of all of DC. Sorry, there's a guy going by. Take the holistic view and even take a holistic view of the entire region, I think is essential to understanding how needs are met, that you're not just taking care of yourself and your own needs, but understanding that this plan is a plan for the entire, that this plan has consequences everywhere in the region.
Thanks, Neil. Before we get to specifics about Chevy Chase, let's draw attention to the big picture involving the racial composition of DC and its environs.
Yeah.
Take us back to 1860, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, and give us a sense of what's happened between then and now.
Absolutely. So, so the thing to think about the racial composition of DC prior to the Civil War is to remember that DC had what were known as black codes. So DC was very small. DC was not that far from abolishing slavery in 1860. Or it hadn't abolished slavery, rather, but the slave markets had been abolished. It's a city that where even free blacks were subject to a significant amount of sort of control, and even if they could afford to live in nice areas, their lives were restricted by many other ways. And what you see after Reconstruction is some level of attempt to integrate, but already by the 1880s, what had substituted that social segregation had suddenly become a spatial segregation. That the lower class blacks were already by the 1880s are located or tend to be found either on majority black blocks or in the alleys. And this sense that this sort of desire for segregation to create the spatial distance as the way of achieving segregation starts to become more profound during suburbanization. So the vast majority of suburban companies, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, were served white individuals. When we start to think first of places like Mount Pleasant, that's the kind of first sort of burst of primarily white suburbs. But at the same time, DC is still bound by Reconstruction laws. So certain things like certain acts of discrimination are actually kind of hard to do for a good amount of time in DC. And so that's why one of the reasons why you don't see things like racial covenants until the 1890s. So even though there may be extremely exclusive spaces like LeDroit Park, if you know that, that was surrounded by a fence, and particularly a fence on the side of Howard University as a way of creating that spatial segregation. And the ability to get away and to create these spaces in a separate area had both significant in terms of quality of life, just because cities were so disgusting in the late 19th century, and then also the sense of racial contagion. You were able to escape that through spatiality. And that's what we start to see as the streetcar, the electric streetcar starts to take off, and that's how you get Chevy Chase, the various neighborhoods on Massachusetts Avenue. And then you have to remember that most of Anacostia was developed for white people, and was but a more working class kind of mood. So that's kind of the pattern that we get to in the historic period.
Okay, well, in turning to Chevy Chase, for the benefit of tonight's participants, we should recall the role of Francis Newlands and the company he created to transform the farmland on both sides of the DC-Maryland line into a white utopia. You want to say a few words about that?
Absolutely. I have some slides for this one.
Okay.
So hold on a second. Forgive me for a moment. Okay. So we can look at, so we'll look at a couple different things. So Francis Newlands, I think sometimes he gets a little bit more attention in this process than he deserves, but you can kind of see that as an individual, he was a very profoundly racist man. And when we talk about people as, was he a man of his times? Sure, but there also was a significant anti-racist, or at least racially sort of aiming for racial neutrality component even within the United States Congress. So you may have remembered during the whole thing about voting rights the past 6 months, or about the possibility of overturning the popular vote in various states, and then people were talking about invoking the 14th Amendment, which contains a provision about removing representation from states that attempt to disenfranchise their citizens. We can talk about this statement that Francis Newlands makes in 1909. And you look 6 years earlier, 1903, congressmen were actually bringing to the floor of the House bills to disenfranchise southern states until in response to Jim Crow. So those states, the African Americans had been enfranchised and they had been removed. So diehard Republicans, who still thought themselves as the party of Lincoln truly, and saw themselves as defenders of civil liberty, were willing to take action against this. Even if you look at someone like Howard Taft, who's kind of we would say a moderate for his time, still would never say something like what Francis Newlands says right in this quote, where he's talking about how they're children, and later on this quote he actually talks about how at least they were better trained under slavery. So I should have couldn't quote the whole thing. Let's put it that way. But when we talk about what his kind of role, I mean, he's kind of not the only person involved in this, right? So there's two major figures here who are both very involved in a lot of the displacements that happen in Chevy Chase, which is Edward Stellwagen, who's a banker who takes over from Newlands when Newlands dies in 1917. And then Harold Doyle, who's, if I read the article in the city paper, he played a major role in both in the clearance of Fort Reno, and was a major real estate broker in the area. And, you know, he lived on, I think, on Harrison Street. Could be wrong about that. So, you know, there's a lot of other people here. And when but we look at Newlands, he does offer certain advantages. This is just Chevy Chase, really quick, Chevy Chase, but we'll skip. One thing that Newlands does have access to after 1893 is that he's a congressman. And so in the development of, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but the street grid in Ward 3 is actually a lot nicer, I think, than other parts of the city. It has a little bit more variation, but it's still very coherent. And a lot of that is because he was able to secure, partially through his influence, a contract to hire another company to design the street grid as kind of a consulting party. And that's the firm of the Olmsted brothers. So Frederick Olmsted was still alive, but he was the senior. The Central Park guy was he was senile at this point in 1895 when they're hired. And so they're able to come in, the two children, Frederick Olmsted Jr. and John Olmsted, and they actually are able to advance a lot of Newlands' vision for the street grid, for city planning, through their contract here. And that actually even gets even more strong. And we can see this is actually a note this is a letter from Francis Newlands, who's actually talking about what kind of park he wants at Reno. No smoking gun, but he clearly was thinking about some aspect of Fort Reno being dedicated as a park as early as 1895. This is Francis Newland's sketch of Reno. But this becomes even more influential once a little bit later, when as Newlands wasn't a senator yet, but still as congressman was able to, I think, pull some weight to get Frederick Olmsted Jr. To be onto what's known as the Macmillan Commission. So obviously you had that lecture a couple weeks ago. I don't know if they talked about this, but the one feature they had was actually placing this very large reservation at Fort Reno. You can see it here. This is what it looks like. It's like the Wicked Witch of the West, little toe popping out. And this is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. So he's able to manipulate these. He's able to manipulate a process in a way that was a little bit atypical for who he was, but not necessarily atypical in terms of the actual practices of the company.
So how unique then was Chevy Chase in its role as a racially exclusive enclave? Mm-hmm. Was it about Newland's vision, his views about race, his organizing acumen, his attention to detail, maybe his political connections, or just the fact that he was one of the first, a first mover, a kind of role model?
Great question. Definitely his political connections, right? But what he's able to, in terms of their processes, he's actually very conservative. His practices are innovative in, say, the 1900s. When he begins in 1890s, he's doing some truly visionary things. He sort of predicted that the affluent population would go in one northwest, which is kind of upwind, away from the smoke and sort of dirty air of the cities. And again, you have to remember, everyone's burning coal for heat, and there are horses just pooping absolutely everywhere. So it's pretty dirty, and so he predicts this trend will happen. I mean, and if you look at a map of the real estate income or real estate in DC and the DC region, the sort of northwest quadrant is where the wealth still is to this day. So he kind of made a good guess. But in terms of his contemporaries, he's interesting because he seems much more again conservative. Is the kind of he's sort of both a visionary and also conservative in that he does not use racial covenants, and he probably which are specific bars on racial groups from owning property that become a part of the property, right? So if you're in it's just same kind of covenant that gets you into an HOA. These provisions he didn't include, and they're because he probably thought that they were unconstitutional. He's a lawyer, and he was very acquainted with some cases that had happened on the West Coast that suggested that racial covenants were unconstitutional. We can look across the other side of the city. There's a man named Arthur Randall, who was in his time arguably a bigger and more influential real estate developer than Francis Newlands. Arthur Randall developed mostly east of the river, but he did so with a public company. So he offered stock in addition to apartments. In addition to homes, he sold stock in his company. He was very interested in bringing outside investors, and he used racial covenants. And he seems to be the first person in DC who used racial covenants on new construction property on a large scale. And so his neighborhoods, though, are now Congress Heights, Randall Highlands, and then some other areas around Fort DuPont. So if we look at his practices, that starts to become more the model. And Chevy Chase stays basically the same up until the late 20s. Once covenants are deemed constitutional, the Chevy Chase Land Company adopts racial covenants. And by that time, kind of Newlands and this old guard are not there. And the thing to remember with them is also that the Chevy Chase Land Company is an investment vehicle for sort of a family fortune, right? It's an investment of a large amount of money from the West Coast. It's one of many investment vehicles that this family owns. Whereas Arthur Randall was looking to make a buck, no doubt. And he had maybe had different tolerance for risk, different expectations from his investors than did this private fund. So I think those are things to compare when you look at their practices. So the earlier generation is very conservative in some ways, and then it sort of falls in line. But the innovators in terms of racial covenants are much more likely to be someone like the W.C.A. Miller Company, who are very strict about racial covenants. There's a number of other companies that start building in DC and ultimately kind of become more dominant that are a bit more aggressive. So
in a sense, it sounds like you're suggesting that Newlands was a laggard, not so much an innovator in some of these things. Continuing on that theme, many know that the Chevy Chase Land Company, and this is something you mentioned, didn't really use racial covenants until the 1920s. So how does Chevy Chase compare to other DC neighborhoods on exclusionary practices?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I feel like I jumped over that question before by accident. But yeah, so what Chevy Chase did was really to orient itself towards maybe a class exclusion. Their goal was to build a neighborhood for wealthy people, for people of certain kind of honestly professions that I learned from my co-author on the Belmont paper that Christian Heinrich, one of the wealthiest men in DC, couldn't get into the Chevy Chase Club when he was alive because he worked in industry, because he owned a brewery, right? Like he was like brewing the beer himself. So there's this kind of this sort of sense of certain class that perhaps precedes but includes race. So they were more happy to use techniques that were very effective at intersecting with particularly structural racism, right? So in this deed, you can see that you have to use the house for residents only. And that seems very normal to us now, but it was not normal until the 1930s, 20s and 30s, when the government began subsidizing homeowners. The majority of houses, either had some kind of, it was not uncommon to have commercial uses within the house, for example. Same with the single family detached, kind of single dwelling unit detached kind of house. All these restrictions that you kind of see here. The key one is that the house value has to be $3,000. And on Connecticut, it'd be $5,000. In those days, that was a lot of money. And quite frankly, it's probably 2 to 3 times the value of the land. Think about your house. Probably now, that's not even close. Your land is much more expensive. But in the day, this was the technique, and that allowed them to basically exclude anyone who couldn't do that, couldn't afford that, which was 99% of Black people, probably the majority of white people as well. So rather than looking for that, rather than try to specifically exclude, they were able to use a number of techniques like that. And we actually have a few slides. So this is kind of like racial. We think of racial covenants as kind of the primary one, but there's actually this big. The Chevy Chase Land Company was happy to use and all the companies in DC, if they did not use racial covenants, they were able to use this sort of cloud of all these different techniques that intersect with structural racism and allow you to exclude without seeming like you're excluding, or at least leave no paper trail, right? So we know that to some degree the Chevy Chase Land Company used these techniques, and in that way, they were sort of middle of the line in terms of their actual practices, because the cost was so consistent, such a consistent. So this way, sort of suggesting, this it creates this network, right, where no one thing fully excludes what you don't want, but you rely on that they're interlocking. They form a sort of a net that catches undesirable uses and undesirable individuals. Right, and then when we get into this, it's techniques like that, particularly after covenants are made illegal, racial covenants made illegal in 1968, and then they're already sort of unenforceable in 1948. These techniques are continue to be sort of employed to some degree, if not directly, then at least indirectly, and that in that way they're very typical. Like, they're homeowners. There have never been more people who live in a homeowners association than today, and that has its roots in the kind of provisions that people like Francis Newlands included in their covenants back in the late 19th century.
Well, part of the marketability, I guess, was this sense of exclusivity, however defined, right?
Absolutely.
So if we turn the question around a little bit and ask to what extent Newlands was pushing on an open door, right? There is an argument to be made that the first generation of Chevy Chase residents implemented his vision to the T. They were well organized in a citizens association that had up to and even exceeding 3,000 members at some point, right? In Chevy Chase, and required their members by their constitution to be white.
Oh, right. Yes. So actually, that's great one. The Chevy Chase Citizens Association. I don't know if you guys can read this slide. This is just a plan from a local newspaper from the period, which is the plan for the clearance of Reno. This is from 1926, I believe. This is the Melvin plan drawn by Melvin Hazen. You can see down in the corner it says the New Schools Committee, the Citizens Association of Chevy Chase. And this cool little logo, which you can't quite see, but they were very they clearly had a sense of what this entailed and how it would be done, and they were supportive. And I think a good way of looking at this I like is like game theory, and there's a really excellent book called Saving the Neighborhood, which is by I'm forgetting their real full names, but Brooks and Rose. And they use these, it's a legal analysis of racial covenants, and they sort of argue that if you look at the game theory scenario for the for the developer there, they essentially have to calculate what amount of profit is lost from not accommodating segregationists versus the amount of profit lost by losing a certain individuals who would be opposed to it. So the night's getting exciting. If you think about this, so if 20, let's say 20% of people don't want don't want racial covenants, if there's and that's wait. Yeah, they sort of are ambivalent. If the number of people who are interested in racial covenants is basically larger than the people who are opposed to it, you're essentially foregoing more profit. And you can basically assume that the vast majority of white people at the time, at the very least, either believed that Black people didn't want to be around Black people, or were at least sort of suspected that they would lower home values or lower the quality of life in a neighborhood. And so there's no incentive for the developer to take that interest. So that's why we would look at people who are not Francis students, who are not, sort of these ardent segregationists. We see that. So I think there was considerable demand within the population already, and I think it's very challenging to prove that, because in some ways, there isn't that racial covenant in the books from it's not written down by the group. It doesn't leave as much documentary evidence, but there's traces of it that seem very clear that they were happy to see pursuing a white vision. And the other thing, of course, is to note is, right, they until 1968, if you were a broker, you could just refuse to sell to Black people. You just said no, and there was nothing you could do about it. And I'm sure that the Chevy Chase Land Company screened the applicants, because we know that other communities like Roland Park in Baltimore, which is very sort of peer of Chevy Chase, or Forest Hills in Queens, New York, we know that they did very extensive research into who was buying in their neighborhoods, and made sure that they had compatible views in addition to compatible persons.
Yeah, so the history has been reassessed, I guess, in recent years. Is the narrative about racial exclusion from suburbs like Chevy Chase, how has it changed in light of newer research?
Totally. So this is actually really interesting, and I think people are always a little surprised by some of the information that comes out in talks like this. But one thing to remember is that almost all the stuff that I'm sort of talking to, these national trends, the books where I read about these trends, I would say about 80% of them have been written since 2000, right? So there's a few suburb studies studying of the suburbs themselves, and these kind of studying of racial patterns of development and home purchasing and settlement, things like that. Relatively new discipline within history, so it's really only since the 70s that it starts to really be more than sort of a few points of light. And then since 2000, there have been a really wonderful range of group of books like David Freund's Colored Property, or books like as another great one about Florida called The World Made More Concrete. And then, of course, there's an excellent book that really delves into Roland Park called How the Suburbs Were Segregated, which came out last year. So there's a lot of reassessment, and people are really looking at things a little bit differently. And of course, The Color of Law is a great example, right? That you mentioned at the beginning, that took 10 years to write, supposedly, and it's based on a lot of research that had already been done when it came out. But even then, that kind of academic writing that had into these studies had not been brought to the public before someone like Rothstein did it. Of course, Rothstein's also a great author. That helped. So.
Let's return to Chevy Chase for a second. With Kim Bender, you recently investigated a telling aspect of the Newlands Chevy Chase Land Company story. The Black investors who proposed to develop a portion of land controlled by the Chevy Chase Land Company.
Right.
That an important aspect. It's important to our discussion because it puts the lie to the notion that the neighborhood's exclusivity was based on class. rather than race, right?
Right.
Can you tell us about the Belmont subdivision?
Well, so that's a great it's a good question. So Belmont, so just really quickly, well, yeah, here these are some ads from Belmont. This is kind of the attitude that you should look at this, and these are most of these are in the Washington the Evening Star, which is the paper. Old timers may remember the Star, young timers probably not. The some of these are also the Washington Post. But you can see they're kind of really advocating how, you know, it's no restrictions on colored people, high class subdivision, ideal suburban lot in the most beautiful, most rapidly improving section of Northwest Washington. Everyone welcome. I think there's another one that says you'll never get you will never find a lot in the finest part of DC available to African colored people is what it says, I'm sure. And this is where it was. I mean, I'm sure everyone knows this is Chevy Chase DC. The Chevy Chase, you can see the baseball diamond from the Chevy Chase. Is that the rec center? Is that what they call it?
Chevy Chase Park, I think.
The Chase Park. Okay. You can see there's this kind of strange strip of where the subdivision here for section 1A of Chevy Chase kind of drops off in a weird way. And that's partially because it was not originally meant to be part of Chevy Chase Section 1A, but instead to be this kind of Belmont community. So let's go back. So what they were doing is they in 1906, well, let me start over. So basically, the Chevy Chase Land Company assembled all the land in the area. At the time, Friendship Heights was basically a neighborhood. Friendship Village, all those large commercial and office buildings and residential condos and stuff like that, was a town of mostly Victorianate, Queen Anne style houses, like you might see in Somerset. Somerset existed, and to some degree Drummond, if you guys know where Drummond is, that existed as a very small neighborhood. And they were all, and most of Chevy Chase was primarily on the a little closer to Connecticut Avenue. So when they assembled, they spun off, the Chevy Chase Land Company spun off a couple pieces of land early on, one of which was called Belmont, and it seems almost to have been spun off sort of to separate off the Chevy Chase streets from Wisconsin Avenue. And they, 4 African-American men by basically using an intermediary, were able to buy this plot of land. And they successfully sold a lot of lots. Allegedly 42 have been sold. And we have about 28 people whose names we can identify within the records, either through extensive litigation that followed. But at the end of the day, what happened is that the Chevy Chase Land Company had it's like a deed of trust, which they were using as a mortgage on the property. And they had provisions that allowed them to refuse to, well, technically it was the bank that was kind of a legal fiction of the Chevy Chase Land Company called the Union Trust Bank, was able to basically say that the African Americans were defrauding, basically were fraudulent for giving all kinds of reasons, and therefore that they didn't have to release the property. This caused sort of the whole affair, the whole development to just fall apart because they ran out of money. Basically, they had to pay the mortgage, and people stopped buying because they couldn't guarantee that people would actually get houses.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. There's a lot of we know what they were really trying to do was build this kind of high-end community. So I think that's sort of saying it's not just class, it is race. It's both. It can be both. But race, clearly, they either the people like the Chevy Chase Land Company, and you can tell certainly from Francis Doohan's personal views, could never imagine a scenario where African Americans could live, even if they were rich. It's this aberration. They're inherently contaminated to people with that particular view. Yeah. And we see that all the neighbors, all the other landowners besides the land company, are just as enthusiastic about feeling like this is contaminated, even if it is wealthy African Americans who want to make you spend a ton of money on your house to keep poorer blacks out. They were just as exclusionary in some ways as well. They were just as eager to ensure that it was not, it was a high quote unquote high class neighborhood.
Fascinating. But tell us, what if Belmont had succeeded? Could we point to an alternative scenario for DC's racial geography in that case?
I think it's really hard to imagine the scenario. I think that if it's possible there would have been a finer grained form of segregation within DC. I think I'm not optimistic that it would have led to any level of integration, but I think we might have seen something like, well, until covenants persisted, I think you could see things sort of getting along, but I can also see things getting kind of outrage problematic. Very sorry. Things getting very testy in the 1950s and 1960s, where you might still see blockbusting, being able to say, well, the Black people are coming over from one neighborhood over rather than from way far away. We can imagine scenarios where, and we can look at what happened in Friendship Village, right? So after Friendship Heights, long after Belmont, Friendship Heights sort of, as we might say, filtered down, and the majority of the large Victorian homes which preceded Chevy Chase had actually become rentals. They've been carved up into multifamily dwellings, and were being rented out. And we know that I don't think it's a coincidence that was the part of Friendship Heights that was designated to be high density residential and commercial and redeveloped when the Metro came, or in anticipation of the Metro. So I think that it's going to be different, but I don't know that it's necessarily going to be positive. I wish I could say it was, but
yeah,
it's tough.
Let's turn to the concept of integrated neighborhoods in the period since the process of suburbanization began. Would you talk about the trajectory of other neighborhoods in DC with different experiences of exclusivity?
Sure. Let me see if I have the slide. I think I have a slide for this. Okay. So, do you guys know where Capitol Heights is? Does everyone know where Capitol Heights is?
Remind us.
Capitol Heights is in Prince George's County. It's directly over the DC line. So it's pretty Black. It's actually pretty Hispanic now. And it's definitely a relatively moderate to low income neighborhood. But as you can see, back in the day, this is an ad from 1906 where they're happy to advertise that it is restricted by racial covenants. So again, a way that we can see that things can be both race and class and inflected. This was meant for lower class individuals. I mean, working class individuals. It was primarily aimed at people who worked at the Navy Yard, it looks like. So working class white people, and they did not require. They say it's within easy reach of a poor man's means, which is to say that they did not include that $5,000 home price. There's no home. But that's something I think about building restrictions, that they don't actually require a particular house to be of a particular price. You buy the lots are small, you can buy as many as you need. It's like Lido pizza, you get like 5 pieces, and you can see they also ban alcohol and Black people. It's this kind of trying to adopt some kind of exclusivity that perhaps they could not achieve just by price alone and social norms. So, and of course, this neighborhood over the course of the 1960s and 1970s almost completely changed race. Randall Highlands, Congress Heights, all these areas east of the river were actually sort of about half white as late as the 1970s. And one exception, of course, being Deanwood. And I wish and what we see is, in this rush of these conversions, all these neighborhoods, it's change race as white flight, which is accelerated by real estate brokers, and also, but again, is still, I think, rooted. At least there's a large percentage of people who did not want to live with Black people. But what you see is the one sort of alternative. Let me see if I have is Shepherd Park. So in Shepherd Park, they started to see white flight, and then blockbusting, which again is where basically a realtor would sort of offer to buy or sort of suggest that a Black person is moving in, or maybe even there's sort of these outrageous stories of paying Black women to push their baby buggies around neighborhoods to sort of create anxiety, and then they'd buy your house for a bargain. And then because African American housing was so constrained in supply, particularly quality housing, they could basically resell it to a Black person for 2 to 3 times the price.
Yeah.
So what Neighbors Inc. does is they sort of go out and say, well, we're going to integrate the neighborhood. That it was not a project of sort of just everyone sticking there. They realized that the structural forces and the sort of racial attitudes of homeowners were such that they had to find people who were willing to integrate the neighborhood and proactively, or as the law says, affirmatively further integration. And this included actually going out and if a white person was selling a house, they would actually go out and find a interested white buyer who might be interested in buying the house, and then finding Black people. And they actually kind of worked out a deal where they were trying to proactively mix the neighborhood in a specific way that whites were still the majority, because they felt that was more palatable, that once it crossed the 50% line, I think it's actually 30%, there was a sense that would cause the dam to break. And the reality is that the home system is that it's true, after a certain percentage of African American population, your home values do go down, and I think there's a couple different reasons for that, none of which are particularly legitimate. So you have to be proactive.
Well, as you well know, I have many other questions for you, but
Okay, am I going over?
Not time is wasting, and there are questions that have been showing up in the chat. So I'm gonna and Chaz has been monitoring that for us. So I'm gonna ask him to come in and have him pose them to you.
Okay.
Chaz.
Sure. I mean, you've got sort of two types of questions, some about the nature of the exclusion, and then some about the what now thing. So let me quickly ask about the exclusion ones. Ed Hayes wanted to know whether nuisance laws were also used to cover these things. And then another, Michael Jennison was asking if there were covenants against Jews and other ethnic groups. He notes that his own house has a covenant against operating a rendering plant, which I'm sure his current neighbors are appreciative of.
Yep.
But there were other covenants in some of these deeds as well.
Okay, so that's but that's kind of so on the covenants topic, yes. So racial covenants are only one form of covenant, right? So a covenant is basically a condition that becomes a part of the property. So I'm sure all the lawyers are finding that definition really simplistic, but you're going to have to deal with it. It becomes a part of the property, and that property is socially constructed. We agree the terms that are part of it, and one of which in common law is this concept of the covenant, which is a promise, so to speak, that comes with the property. Historically, covenants basically were some of the first covenants were new outside of in real estate development. The first major covenants were actually in terms of nuisances, right? Just like he was saying, a rendering plant, these things that are incredibly noxious, and we now have zoning perhaps to do, and we have air quality, or actually more to the point, we have air quality regulations, and we have things like that actually get to the heart of it. But back in the day, there were very few regulations like that. So essentially, if you controlled enough property, you could get everyone on the property to agree to not do certain things, and that would preserve the neighborhood of certain characteristics that you wanted to keep in the neighborhood, and keep nuisances away. So that's kind of that. And racial covenants then become a certain form of basically treating other people as nuisances. And apartment buildings are oftentimes considered a nuisance. And various courts have had various opinions about things like that, because it is somewhat subject to the opinion of the court as to what a nuisance is. But yeah, they're very common. Nuisances are very common, and there's particularly uses of nuisance and police power, were very involved in the adoption of covenants on the West Coast, which was the West Coast adopted covenants much more strongly, particularly in relation to Chinese and Japanese people. And sort of pursuing, and one tactic that was used in there was pursuing Chinese laundries as a nuisance, or other Chinese businesses. In terms of other ethnic groups, it's very common for Jews to be on the list. Roland Park famously did not have an anti-Jewish covenant, but they only accepted like Jews who were teaching at Johns Hopkins University to get citations. Chevy Chase again didn't have any. I don't believe any of the adjacent properties that had racial covenants used them, but Spring Valley did, right? So Spring Valley, all the ones done by the WC and A.M. Miller Company, they had Jews, they had Armenians. Were included in that, which is bad.
Some of the work we've been doing, Neil, on this mapping segregation, looking at racial covenants in Chevy Chase, have come up with Armenians, Mongolians, and it's an unpredictable pattern. I'm not sure which lawyers were sticking in their most disfavored ethnic group.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. And actually, there's some really interesting ones that start to come up in the 1920s as the sort of questions of constitutionality are kind of crossing with public health ideas. And there's a one in Silver Spring that's sort of that I think is not totally unknown. It basically says that individuals of a race that are like lower, that have a death rate lower than the white race, cannot live in particular subdivisions, right? So they're trying to make it scientific, that it is really truly a health thing, right?
A death rate higher than the white race.
Sorry, yes, right.
Let me look at the other questions here. If we could, in the communities that were being broken up, whether it was Fort Reno or other places, was there, people couldn't vote here in the district,
Yes.
but was there legal pushback? Did some African Americans hire lawyers, or what were the courts doing here? Were they just supporting it, what was going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the most part, what the thing to understand about the early 20th century is that property rights were supreme, right? So where the most successful pushback comes is actually sort of in people exerting their property rights, that land is not properly condemned. There really is, apart from one or two Senate sort of appearances at Senate hearings, there's almost no pushback in terms of a language of civil rights for these. Important in the ability to maintain these kind of racial hierarchies is that African Americans who maybe had a little bit more privilege, maybe had nice government jobs before they were sort of taken away by Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. There were incentives for them to sort of play by the rules, that not to get too difficult. And even when we look at something like the NAACP, it still had, its funders were still white for the most part, and those donors that did have a kind of dampening effect on some of their agitation. In the specific case of Reno, there were legal pushback, but it was always in the language of property rights. The land was not condemned properly. There's sort of one exception that I can think of where in Reno, the individual James Neal sues on behalf of a man named Samuel Hebron for the purchase of Alice Deal High School. And he specifically says the real reason for this is racial animus, but then he immediately defaults back to talking about how the property condemnation was inappropriate.
So Chuck Ludlam asks a question that people can see, and that basically that if Newlands controlled everything from the Taft Bridge way up to Bethesda, and was as racist as we say, and those of us who live in the big leafy homes now, are currently not able to subdivide if we wanted to. But if we can't undo these estates, how can we undo the damage that Newlands did? And then DCT, someone named DCT asked a similar question. If the Chevy Chase Land Company still exists, it made a bunch of money doing what it did. But now they, have major holdings at Van Ness and Friendship Heights. They're building residential housing up at Chevy Chase Lakes. Couldn't they contribute to fixing the damage today by, for example, contribute to affordable housing, some sort of restorative justice?
Yeah, I think that's a conversation that needs to happen in terms of the Chevy Chase Land Company. But I am sort of a little leery about singling them out and sort of thinking only on the local scale. So even when we talk about the Chevy Chase Land Company, they've moved a lot of, they actually have really started opening up a lot of investments out in Virginia. They're doing this big development out at the Wheelie Reston East Metro Station. So even if we speak in a regional space, the sort of they're thinking in a more regional space, in a real regional or even national level. If you want to have a sort of restorative, reparative justice angle, I think you need to do that because a lot of people were displaced by, even though it's important to pay attention to the way that this has affected every single Black person, whether they were displaced by these kind of policies at every level, from the federal government. And of course, if you read Color of Law, he does talk about federal reparations in particular. And so I think it's very important to have this be very universal rather than sort of saying, well, we're focused on the neighborhood. I think that in order to have that kind of restorative or reparative work, I think there's a lot of work we need to do because we don't really even know. We have to find the people who are descended if we're trying to do this, which no one's done. And then also sort of take it on to the next scale, that maybe organizing with other communities to enact a broader system that is this kind of identifying not just these particular topics that I've been working on, but also topics from across the city, because I think otherwise you lose interest, and so that we'll find there was another displacement somewhere else that then they have to organize. It's better to find them now and group together to find a holistic approach to that, is my opinion.
So two last questions before I ask Carl to wrap up.
Sure.
One is, and we haven't talked about this before, but we aren't the only city and the only community facing this challenge.
Exactly.
Are there people doing innovative things, other places that you're aware of that are dealing with this, how you repair the damage?
Sure. So when we talk about something like the small area plan that the mayor has proposed in the comprehensive plan that was just passed yesterday, in some ways those are it's a laggard plan. I think that they're not being as ambitious, particularly in terms of the racial equity things. Adding housing supply in areas that are that do not present a displacement risk, like Chevy Chase. I think it's an unalloyed good. I mean, I think that will it'd be good, frankly, good for the neighborhoods, and then it will in terms of improving walkability and things like that. But from a racial justice lens, sort of easing the pressure, the sort of price pressure, or opening up other spaces elsewhere in the city, because again, the markets they're not the same, all the same market, but they are interlinked, and there's been some great research on that. But at the same time, that there could go much further, right? I mean, we have this government land that could be discussed as having specific affordability. A couple interesting options you can look at are things like the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts passed something where that's an 100% affordable housing overlay. So a lot of if you build a building that has a certain level of affordability, you can basically get very large bonuses in your development, which allows for the land price to be more affordable on a per unit basis for affordable housing developers than other developers, which allows them to compete in expensive neighborhoods because they're building more housing.
Neil, we're running out of time.
Okay, sorry.
I respect people's time, but I want to ask you. You started out by alerting us to the oath that A and C commissioners make to be commissioners for the whole city.
Right.
well, we're here in our little neighborhood, but what can we be doing that is contributing to making the district better and more affordable as a whole? I want to push back about only focusing on the local.
Okay, fine. Well, I mean, I think it is to sort of think about the proactive stuff. I mean, I think it's finding unity with individuals, like Carl said at the beginning. It's like trying to identify, find out what people who cannot afford to live in Chevy Chase are need and want, and understand and make connections like that, and sort of think. I think that's one important thing to think about, how addressing their needs would be seen on the local level. And I think a level increase in density on the avenue is good. And I think that identifying ways to make that density better is a really important way to make it move forward politically. And I think also there's doing history and trying to understand what has happened, and is really important in terms of advancing. Sort of advancing policies and moving the neighborhood towards a reckoning with its with the problematic aspects of its past.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for contributing to us doing just that. Carl, can you wrap us up?
I will wrap us up. First of all, heartfelt thanks to Neil Flanagan for engaging with us on DC's racial geography and factors supporting inclusive neighborhoods. You've put us in a much better position to support those factors in the planning process going forward. By now, we're all very much looking forward to seeing your book on DC in the 1920s. And equally heartfelt thanks for those of you who have supported us with donations tonight. Let me end with 3 reminders. First, please do take the planning survey. Your voice matters. Forward the link to your friends and acquaintances. Second reminder, Historic Chevy Chase DC has organized a Zoom panel focusing on affordable housing in our neighborhood on Wednesday, June 9th, with a superb cast of characters. You will be able to sign up for it on our website, so check that out. And now, finally, for those of you who are Historic Chevy Chase DC members, as we bid adieu to all other participants tonight, please stay with us for a very brief membership meeting. Good evening, everyone, and stand by. Thanks, Neil.